As ever with Laura Kunzberg's show, it was often it is the minor characters, the little panel, which is the interesting bit. Though I will come back and talk about her interview with Nigel Farage later because I think she doesn't contextualize Farage, and Farage is possibly blaming a particular faction for what happened to Trump. And I understand why Farage was selected as a friend of Trump to comment on what happened last night. But nevertheless, the BBC should be contextualising a little bit more. The person who really stood out for his calmness, for his sense, was Samuel Kasumu, who is a former advisor of Boris Johnson, and he held the brief of civil societies and communities, and he's an interesting man. And he resigned, I think, too soon. And maybe if he'd remained in post for longer, there could have been more of an interesting effect. He could have had more effect. He could have had more sense. More sense could have been injected into the Boris Johnson situation. But I liked him. Listen to what he said while he was talking. I'm afraid I did some drawings, and so you get the soundtrack from the BBC and the drawings from me, and I think what more can I say? Just admire and be impressed by what he's got to say, because it's sound. It's genuinely sound.
Why do you want to get involved when it's so toxic?
Yeah, I ask myself that question very, very often, to be honest. As you will probably remember, when I left my job in Downing Street, one of the things I warned about was this politics of division.
That's right. Under Boris Johnson. So you worked for Boris Johnson and you quit because you were unhappy at the direction of travel.
Yeah, because I felt like I feel like politicians have a responsibility to have some candor about how they articulate themselves and recognise that their words have power. And in fact, my first interview after I left, I said, well, we don't want to have another situation like Joe Clark's. And within a year, of course, of that interview, David Amos sadly was murdered. And so whilst it is always the responsibility of the individual who commits the crime for the crime, I think we all have a role to play as a political class. And people always talk about the root causes. One of the things that I think often gets missed is this idea of being able to bring people together. So we are in the UK, in the US to an extent, we're a nation of different types of groups, and we've evolved greatly over the last 75, 76 years since the time of the Empire Wave Rush and Commonwealth migrants and migration from Europe, etc. But no government has ever really focused on, okay, so how then can we all be brought together? How can we find ways to build relationships with people that might feel or think differently from ourselves, might have different cultural norms, etc. And we'll probably talk later about the Euro final, and that's an opportunity that brings people together. In 2012, we had the Olympics. That brought people together, but we can't just have events. We have to have sustainable moments for us to build bridges and a collective culture and identity that we can all feel a part of as well.
And that's the impact on democracy, isn't it? We lose good people from public life, and there's many examples of people who've stepped away, not solely because of intimidation and threats, but partly because of that. And also, why would a young person want to get involved in politics when they see how toxic it can be? And that's the risk that we've got to our democracy.
And what kind of thing in this campaign have you seen, Kim?
I have to say, my campaign in my new seat of Spen Valley was very civilised. In the main part, I was very fortunate. But some of the things that we've seen, some of the things that our colleagues have been through, Shabana Mahmood, Jess Phillips, Rushan Arali, Helen Hayes, I could go on. The personal insults, the attacks, the posters of people's faces, just horrendous types of intimidation and threatening behaviours. And then also activists, people who are doing this on a voluntary basis because they believe in a person or they believe in a political party, going out on the streets, being shouted at, having things thrown at them. Is that what our democracy looks like? It's absolutely fine to disagree passionately and robustly. I'd be the first person to say, let's sit down and talk about it. Let's have a chat. Let's have a conversation about it. But if we resort to violence and threats and abuse and intimidation, there is a deeply worrying impact on our democracy, and we have got to push back on that as